Tina Röck, welcome to this second iteration of the podcast, New Voices in Phenomenology, where we are talking about contemporary positions in phenomenology, new approaches, maybe also on the intersection with different disciplines or sub-disciplines of philosophy. And I know that you are working on quite a few intersections when it comes to phenomenology. And so my first question to you would also be, what would you even understand as phenomenology? Is it a method? Is it a way of life, so to speak? Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. And that's a big question. And I think I would like to answer that in two ways. One, what it's done for me personally in my personal research. And secondly, how I use it or how I consider it phenomenologically. So personally, I've always been really interested in metaphysical systems. So I really like those really abstract, theoretical, big systems, the ones that aren't very trendy right now. And I've always worked on metaphysics and ontology until I encountered phenomenology in the form of Heidegger. And working through his thoughts and his books and his way of seeing the world really helped me to see something that was missing in those traditional systems, namely, how does this relate to the world we live in? So phenomenology for me is the kind of bridge, the stopgap that helps me investigate, are my theories actually relevant? Does it make an actual difference in the world? What phenomena are impacted by the theories that I'm presenting, right? So in a way, just like when Heidegger said, Husserl gave him eyes to see, I'd say Heidegger gave me a body to experience, something like that, right? To really engage with the world around me. My dog is saying hi. So that's a personal level. So for me, phenomenology, it's always really important to see the phenomenon behind the metaphysical description. So if you just have like a claim about essences or substances, and that has no impact on any phenomenon of experience, it kind of seems irrelevant to me now. That's a more personal experience. And philosophically, for me, phenomenology is a method. It's a way of doing philosophy that can't be substituted and is not supposed to substitute other ways of doing philosophy. It's so I'm a big fan of Wittgenstein when he talks about words when he says words are like, it's like a toolbox. You have a hammer, you have a saw, you have all sorts of different things, and you can use words differently. And for me, philosophical methods are that kind of toolbox. So I'm against philosophical monism when it comes to methods, right? And I always say to my students, if they ask me what's the best method or which method should I use, I always say, well, if you want to build something, don't you need different methods appropriate to the thing that you're building or appropriate to the materials you're working with? So if you want to build a table, a hammer is not going to be good enough. And the same thing, I think, goes for philosophy. If I want the more complex and the more interdisciplinary, as you called it, my investigation is, the more methods I will need. And as you said, my research focuses on the intersection of phenomenology, metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology. So I think all of those things, I'm trying to think them together. And there is no one single method that will allow me to do that. So depending on the argument that I'm working on or the thing I'm thinking through, I will use different methods. And philosophy has become, or phenomenology has become indispensable as part of that bouquet of methods for me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a method, but it's an important one for me.
Okay. And so you've mentioned that you draw on Heidegger and maybe on Husserl too. And we know that there's sort of this own history of phenomenology with the sort of different positions that in some ways may be mutually exclusive. Does this sort of proper perspective within the phenomenological tradition play a big role in your own appropriation of phenomenology, or do you just, as you say, just really grab the tools that you need from, Husserl, from Heidegger, from whomever is available?
so I again have to say it's kind of both, because I don't really perceive those discrepancies as clearly as others might, because I feel like the phenomenon that Husserl is looking at just is different from the phenomenon that Heidegger is looking at. So they're interested in different aspects. It might be even a comparable phenomenon, but they're always focusing on different aspects. So Husserl is very much focused on clarifying, depending on the investigation that we're looking at. But I work a lot on time consciousness. So Husserl there is very much focused on really understanding the layers of time experience. That's his focus. Whereas when Heidegger talks about time, he's much more interested in the interrelation between time and being. It's a different phenomenon. It's still time. It's still the same object of investigation, but it's looked at from a different phenomenological perspective, I would say. And I think that goes for all phenomenologists. So if you look at Merleau-Ponty, what he does, he always looks at the phenomenon through the body, right? And it's these slight differences in using the method, the slight differences in the object that we're interested in, that generate new systems or new ways of thinking or new aspects that have been overlooked from the other perspective. And this is what I mean by plurality, right? If you really look closely at how any of those thinkers, Edith Stein, Martius that we just talked about, how they use this method, they always adapt it to the precise phenomenon and the precise interest that they are that they have in looking at the phenomenon. In my book Dynamic Realism, I tried to explain this in these later chapters, that to understand whether description or method is adequate, you can't just simply say this is phenomenology or we are just looking at the phenomenon of time. You really need to look much more closely, much more precisely. From which perspective am I looking at the phenomenon of time? What's my research interest in looking at the phenomenon of time, and what tools am I using? And if you take all of these together, I don't see don't see fundamental discrepancies between the different stances.
Mm-hmm. And so you've talked about the different phenomena coming into view, sort of helping us to discover different aspects. And in my head, I would like to add of being in a way, because famously Aristotle said being is said in many different kind of ways. And so this would be the question that sort of springs to mind when you talk about this plurality of phenomenological methods. Are they actually unified in the way that they are all relating differently to the same being? So is this ontological sort of level something that can actually give unity to different phenomenological approaches, or is this a discrepancy that cannot be mediated in this obvious way?
Yeah, and here beautifully you bring in my ontological stance, because that depends on what kind of ontology you have. And since I presuppose a process ontology, there is no contradiction, because, and I don't know how much the viewers are aware of process ontology, so I'll just introduce it a little bit. So the idea is that reality is fundamentally becoming, fundamentally creative, fundamentally relational, and fundamentally changing, right? So all, and I, for somebody who's not done process philosophy, this might sound a bit weird or strange, and I try to introduce it in my book as well, but the idea is that reality is a networked becoming of relations, of processes. And what we call individuals or objects are simply a certain set of processes that are unified by the mind into an object. So when you ask me if all of these phenomenological stances refer to the same being, then I can say yes, they refer to process, but process is inherently plural, right? There is no one stable static process that's there once and for all, which I can refer to. Process is in itself creative, related, so it's open to its environment and becoming. And with that ontology at the basis, this plurality of methods doesn't negate realism. So I don't need to say, no, it's a mere artifact that we're referring to. we are referring to ontological reality, just that ontological reality is fundamentally changing and becoming and unfolding. And therefore, the descriptions from different perspectives are going to look different, because there is no stable static entity that we could refer to from an atemporal or eternal perspective. Right? So the idea is, if our universe, if science is correct and our universe has become with the Big Bang and has been unfolding all throughout this time, any description of the universe as such will depend on which moment we are looking at. Just as an example, right? If I look at the universe before the Big Bang, if that's the correct description, then it would look very differently than if I look at the universe after the Big Bang, right after the Big Bang, or now, right? So that could look like different descriptions, but they're not. They're just referring to different temporal phases. And the same can be said about spatial relationality, because processes are also spatially open. So from different spatial perspectives, it will appear different, not because it's a different thing, but because it's internally changing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it sounds like when the phenomenon itself sort of refers to the process of being, then at least intuitively, it would seem that something like static phenomenology would be maybe less adequate to actually address the phenomenality of the process than sort of this a more genetic view, in the sense that we can try to abstractly look at a phenomenon and sort of just investigate its static features, or we can consider the phenomenon as changing, and maybe also ourselves as we interact with the phenomenon as changing as well. So does this sort of reciprocity between process and the one who views the process play a role in your research as well?
So I would say there again, whether a static description or a genetic description is more adequate depends on the question that I'm asking. Because I can ask questions about, what's the idea of future? What is memory? What is a remembered object? What is, I don't know, what are the layers of temporality? If I have that research question, it might actually be important to first have a static description, to get a first grab of the phenomenon that I'm interested in, because genetic descriptions or processual descriptions are immensely complex. If we have no general grasp, no idea of what we're looking at, it might just be overwhelming to begin with a genetic description. And sometimes a genetic description might simply not be necessary. It really depends on the phenomenon that I'm interested in and the question that I'm asking of the phenomenon. So there's no a priori way to say this is better than that. Logical investigations or essential investigations can be really, really helpful. They become problematic only when we forget that these static or abstract investigations do not refer to or represent actual reality in its concreteness, right? So a static description can be really helpful but it becomes problematic when I try to fit the phenomena and all of the phenomena into the static structure. When I try to cut off all the elements that are dynamic or changeable in order to get my phenomenon precise and clear. This is what Alfred North Whitehead, a thinker I work a lot with, called the bifurcation of nature and the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So we tend to separate the clearly understandable static from the dynamic and changeable, and then we forget that we abstracted from concrete reality, that our abstract analysis is an abstraction from the concrete phenomenon of change. That doesn't make the abstraction useless or the static description useless. It just merely means that we shouldn't confuse the abstract description, which is generally framed in terms of essences and substances or stable relations, with the actual reality, which is dynamic and changing. So there is no a priori better or worse. It really depends on what you want to do with it.
Okay, thanks. That's a very helpful answer, I think. And it brings me to the chapter of your new book, Dynamic Realism, that we want to discuss a little bit. And the chapter is called The Nature of Time, Temporality, and Being. And maybe I will oversimplify a little bit, just to rehash those ideas that you present there, because they are actually align very well with what you just said about the different sort of levels of conceptual complexity, because in it you talk about the relation between being and time, and there's different conceptual ways to approach this relation. Of course, one would be sort of more objective, where time is sort of seen as a container, as a series of discrete events. And then there's a second perspective, which is closely aligned to something like Husserl's time consciousness, where time is the flow of experience, where there's no objective change in a way, because it's always the change that I am myself. So there's no divorce between flow and experience. And then the third level is this processual ontology that you refer to a lot, which looks at first almost like a synthesis of the other two, but I suspect that it's not just a synthesis, but it's something in its own right. And maybe you can talk a little bit about these conceptual distinctions and how do you work with them, and what you want to bring out in this chapter about the relation of being and time.
Yeah, so as is, I think, obvious, I'm very interested in the relation of being and time and how you can think temporal being, so beings in time, because I believe that if you look at the world we live in, and I think this is the one claim no philosopher has ever disagreed with, the world we live in changes. I'm not sure if there's somebody who agrees with that, but I do think we every single philosopher so far has agreed on the claim that actual reality, the physical world we live in, is temporal changes. And I use temporality and change as synonyms, because I don't believe that you can conceive of change without temporality. That's another argument, which I argue for elsewhere. I'm just going to presuppose that here. And now I'm interested, so how can I think being in time? And one way to think it, as you said, is just this idea of time being a container or a timeline, and this way of thinking time that underlies a lot of our science, that underlies the way we measure time. So this is a way of time that's very much abstracted from actual change and process, and it's very much trying to find the stable underlying structure that can help us understand time, right? And again, there's nothing wrong with doing this. The problem only arises if we forget that this is not actually how we experience time, or how the phenomenon of time actually shows up in the world, right? Then, and if I'm interested, and this is my research question, the ontology of ontological beings or real beings, then this abstract way of thinking time can't be my guideline, right? And the second way of looking at time, or the second metaphor we're generally using for time, is the flow of time, which is closely associated and I think well grasped by phenomenologists and process thinkers alike, like William James, Bergson, and Whitehead also have this awareness of the flow of time, of the experience of time, where time becomes something that is rooted in consciousness and unfolds for us, and it becomes a quasi, it becomes extended, it becomes malleable. So it's not as clear and linear as objective time, it's extended, it's experiential, and it grounds our experience of temporality. And I say, and I'm using here the method of normal language analysis. I say in language, we also have a third metaphor, in everyday ways of speaking, we have a third metaphor describing temporality or time, which is the idea of unfolding or unfurling. And this is, I think, the way of understanding time that can be rooted in process ontology. And before I go into that, I just want to emphasize that these different layers aren't to be reduced one to the other or combined one to the other. I would say these are three distinct, valuable ways of analyzing what time is. developed and used to explain different phenomena and to account for different investigative aims. And my claim in the book is, if I want to understand concrete reality in its concreteness, linear time and phenomenological time don't work. Linear time because it's too abstract, and phenomenological time because it's too grounded in consciousness. So if I want to understand time as ontological in a concrete world that we live in, I point to this third concept of time, which is time as unfolding. And this idea is that time is actually what happens when beings become. So time isn't rooted in one's being's experience. Temporality is rooted in every becoming. Every becoming creates in its becoming its own flow of time, its own temporality. And what we've done in objective time is we've taken one of these processes, one of these flows, and generalized it and made it the measure of all temporalities. This flow can now be or this process can now be the movement of the sun around the earth, which is the day cycle, the movement of the moon, which is the moon cycle, the earth around the sun. I said it inversely, right? So Copernican revolution is still in place. Or we can take like the oscillations of a cesium atom and take that process as the standard that defines how time unfolds. But what it actually is, it's grounded in just one of the processes that constitute time. Every concrete being that becomes constitutes its own temporality, would be the claim of that third timeline. And the way to think through this time is, if we think about phenomena like plants and animals, and these are the phenomena that I generally use to think about processes, because to me in process ontology, biology is the much better Leitwissenschaft than physics. So if you think about the temporality that's embodied by a tree, right? So in traditional ways of, in an objective view, you'd be like, okay, the future is primary, then there is the present, and then everything fades into the past. That's a classical view of the flow of time in objective description, right? The future moves towards the present and then fades into the past. But if you look at a tree, that description seems really awkward, right? It seems really strange. What you would do is you might want to say what you see of the tree right now, and look at its becoming from the past to gather some information about the trajectory of its future, right? So if you look at your being now, and you look at the actions you've taken in the past and the experiences that you've taken in the past, and you look at how they kind of shaped the being that you're now, you kind of will get a non-determinate, open, but still a trajectory towards where this process might go if no major interference shifts, right? And that is the kind of temporality that I'd be looking at if I look at the temporality of concrete beings. I think that was very complicated. Sorry.
No, and I think that was also what I would be most interested in this sort of existential perspective that you have just broadly painted for us just now. And we also find in this chapter the sentence that we dwell in time. So it sounds a little Heideggerian, but so maybe the question would be, how do we understand ourselves sort of as these processual creatures in a way? And you already said that the future is, to put it very provocatively, sort of derivative of the past, even because the process, sort of the becoming of the past, hasn't stopped becoming, in the sense that it's still ongoing, and there's still sort of this I'm swept away by my own being, sort of.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that one.
Do you try to work out this idea in the context of existing phenomenological, existential theories, or is it something that you want to sort of put in another direction? Because we have, for instance, in Heidegger, this sort of decision, very big pathos around this claiming your own future and all that stuff. And one could get it in a different sense. So what is your take on the existential implications, sort of yeah?
So I'm gonna have to show my cards here. I'm a horrible existentialist. I'm, as I said at the beginning, I'm very much interested in abstract systems, metaphysics, and ontology, and that's what I'm good at. As soon as we then actually, and in metaphysics, I always preach for, you know, go to the phenomenon, go down to earth, and go into experience, and work with concreteness, which then to my I can't do. So I just feel what I would like to do is I would like to open with my philosophy, I'd like to open a door for ways of thinking that other people can pick up. And this is one of those lines of thought that could be really interesting, but they're just not in my purview. They're just not the kind of thing I tend to think about or work with. Not because they're not important, but just simply because the way I think is shaped in such a way as to always tend towards the abstract, always tend towards the systematic. And so I have great difficulties in applying what I do. And I'm always really overjoyed when I see somebody taking something I've worked with or taken an inspiration from my work and actually does something with it. But I myself, I'm no good at that.
Okay. And with this metaphysical bias, if you want to call it that, I think this is a nice way to round out our conversation, which has given me a very graphic insight into what you're interested in. And I was very thrilled by what you said, and hope to see more of your research in the future. So thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for our watchers and listeners for your patience.
Thanks.